Hi, welcome to Culturally Determined on Blogging Heads TV. I'm your host, Aryeh Cohen-Wade, and my guest today is Scott Shaffer. Scott, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, my name is Scott. I'm a master's student in urban planning at the Humphrey School at the University of Minnesota, a proud resident of Minneapolis, and a former content editor for bloggingheads.tv.
Right, so the reason I'm having you on today is because I read an article online and it immediately made me think of you, and that article was in the Atlantic. I think it was by Derek Thompson, is that right?
Yep, that's right.
And it's called "The Miracle of Minneapolis." The article kind of makes the case that like Minneapolis is like the like under the radar best city in the country, and it points out that they're doing a lot of things right in terms of urban planning. They have a very low unemployment rate, and it's kind of becoming a cool city to move to in the way that Brooklyn and Portland are as well. And
hmm
since you are a Minneapolis resident and studying urban planning, I thought you would have some good insights into this. So what did you think of the article?
I like the spirit of it. I've been a long time Minneapolis booster. I think it's great that we have a low unemployment rate and lots of stuff to do. I think we're kind of like a cold Portland, but with jobs. And so, but I immediately saw some of the shortcomings. I saw that he hadn't analyzed the racial dimension of it, and a lot of the huge and sort of varied racial disparities that we have in the region, and also the ways that we might be falling behind. I follow a lot of transportation politics in the state, and that really concerns me when I see places like Seattle or Denver or even Houston, outpacing Minneapolis and St. Paul when it comes to transportation funding and projects.
Okay, so why don't we first talk about what you think Thompson's article gets right about Minnesota, and we can talk about your criticisms of the article. And then the Atlantic also posted an article. I think they called it "Minneapolis's White Lie," kind of a clever title.
hmm
That what a critique of the piece along kind of racial lines. So what do you think that the piece got right?
Yeah, well, I thought it was interesting that he talked about our redistributive tax system, like on the regional level, because if you have, if you tax different businesses, at the municipal level, um, just in a region, you're sort of gonna have a race to the bottom, where each neighboring city is like, well, I'll give you a couple like cents lower, tax, and until you're like not taxing any businesses at all, and you're not getting any revenue, and so all these businesses locating isn't really helping anyone. But if you take a look at sort of if businesses have the choice to accept a lower tax rate, but they have to pick up and move to a different region, that their elasticity, they're going to stay put and endure a lot higher tax rate. And so that's something we would study in urban economics, and so that's a really important thing that Minneapolis and St. Paul do right.
Right. Is that like a unique? Or were they the first ones to institute this kind of tax plan, or is this a common thing across the country?
I don't do a lot of comparative research. I do know that we have a metropolitan council which governs the 7 county metro area, and that's a novel regional government. We're kind of leading the way with that. I know Portland, Oregon has another one too. Of course they do, but yeah, I know that we're sort of leading the way with regional government.
And what about the article talked about the surprising number of Fortune 500 companies
hmm
located in Minneapolis. Target is one of them. And is Procter and Gamble the other one?
Um, we have Best Buy, U.S. Bank, General Mills,
General Mills,
3M.
right?
Yeah,
Yes. I mean,
yeah.
what do you think is the reason for that unusual clustering?
Well, I mean, you can see that, General Mills, they actually grew out. I liked that, Thompson's article talked about the history of Minneapolis and the economy and all the mills that are now being turned into, really cool artist lofts
Hmm.
along the Mississippi River. Um, and so, you can tell how General Mills like sort of came out of Pillsbury and, became its own thing. And I have friends who work in advertising over there. And so, Yeah, why do they? Well, and 3M is Minnesota Milling and Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing,
Hmm.
and so it is part of having the yeah. I guess it's just a sweet spot, with an industry cluster where we have mining up in the Iron Range past Duluth, and we have a big university down here and some milling. Yeah, and really high college education rate, and
Hmm.
so it's a highly educated workforce that kind of draws from a really vast region from the center of the country. If there's nothing between here and Seattle, basically, then you have every kid who grows up in a farm town in greater Minnesota, North or South Dakota, most of Kansas. They're if they want to move to a city, the nearest one is going to be Minneapolis.
Hmm. Right. So there's a large geographical talent pool to draw from.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
so anything else you think the article really got right about good things about Minneapolis before we move on to kind of the critique?
No, I'm ready to jump in the critique
Okay,
if you
and
want. Yeah.
we'll probably talk more about the good things in Minnesota and Minneapolis later
Mm.
on. But yeah, so I mean, what do you think the article did not say about Minneapolis?
Yeah, it didn't really touch on the race issue at all, and I think like so it's helpful to distinguish Minneapolis and St. Paul, the core cities, from the greater Minneapolis-St. Paul area,
Hmm.
which is the greater area has about 3 million people in it. The core cities have about 700,000 people in it. And so when you're talking about MSP, you're mostly talking about suburbs.
Hmm.
And well, I think the total metro area is a little less white proportionally than like the United States on average. The suburbs are much whiter than the average
Hmm.
American community.
Hmm.
And yeah, there are just all sorts of inequities. There are, besides just the obvious, income inequality. I work a lot with the Minneapolis Bicycle Coalition, and when we think a lot about healthy, sustainable transportation, and we look at rates in African American communities of diabetes and obesity are like twice what they are in primarily white communities,
Hmm.
and so those are the sort of inequities that are in our communities that are a pretty direct result of the built environment and of public policy decisions that I think are really problematic.
Hmm. So what is the public transportation system like in the Twin Cities?
Well, we have two light rail lines. One connects Minneapolis and downtown Minneapolis to downtown St. Paul. That just opened this year in June 2014.
Hmm.
And then we have another one that opened in 2004 that connects the the airport in a southern suburb to downtown Minneapolis.
Hmm. So there's
And
no subway system.
no subway system.
Hmm.
Yeah, they might have been thinking about it in the 70s, but no subway system.
Hmm.
And I think it's okay to talk about the history real quick. We had a streetcar system
Hmm.
that was built in the 1890s, and it connected. I don't know. There was hundreds of miles of streetcar that connected the two downtowns and connected to a giant lake, Minnetonka, which is in the southwest, and up to Stillwater, Minnesota, to the northeast of the metro. And it's every urbanist in the Twin Cities area just their hearts ache when they look at these old 19 teens, 1920s, 1930s maps of the Minneapolis, St. Paul area and how much rail that we used to have. And now we're considering building a new modern streetcar, kind of like how Portland has, and I think Milwaukee is working on it too.
Right.
And so
What's your thought on streetcars versus there are only so much there's only so much money you can invest in public transportation in any place, and there's kind of a debate online between people who think a streetcar is the best idea, and a lot of politicians seem to like the streetcar, and then people who think improving the bus is the better way to spend the money because the bus can go anywhere, whereas the streetcar is obviously limited to where you lay down the rails. But it seems like the streetcar just kind of in the cultural understanding of it, or kind of like like a tourist would never come somewhere to ride the bus, but like tourists would come somewhere to ride the
mhm.
streetcar. So what do you
Yeah.
think about that?
Yeah, I mean it's complicated, right? Because on the one hand you have you just want to serve as many passengers as possible, and streetcars aren't good at that, and buses are better. You can increase you can increase the frequency of buses a lot quicker than you can just tack on more streetcars
Hmm.
to each other, concatenate them, because eventually you're going to have streetcars stopping and blocking intersections like behind the station.
Hmm.
And especially if you look at it on on a benefit per dollar spent basis, that's pretty bad. But when you look at it on a how much are you building a good city, with a bus system versus with a streetcar system? I think there's a lot of research that shows that people will come and invest money in the city and build beautiful things if they see the permanence of some rail lines going down the street.
Hmm.
And like you said, that'll bring in tourists. And if you're looking at it and saying, well, is it really better to spend money on a bus or better to spend money on a streetcar? Sometimes that's not the decision. Sometimes the decision that they're making is, should we spend money on a streetcar, or should we spend money, a quarter billion, $500 million on a interchange between two freeways in the suburbs?
Hmm.
And then when you look at how much money they're wasting, building these highway interchanges that just sort of loop and swirl over each other, that gets really depressing and makes me think, yeah, we should be building money. We should be spending money on trains, even
Hmm.
if, it's better if not the best.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's a great point. Yes, I mean, so the racial critique. I mean, I read the piece in the Atlantic, and I don't know. It didn't seem super convincing to me. I mean, it seems like there's no like perfect American city that's like a utopia where like everyone in the community is like benefiting from economic growth and there's no racial tension and like these barometers that we say like are signs of like social flourishing are the same for all minority groups. I mean, do you think there's particular things that Minneapolis and St. Paul are failing to do that other cities are doing a better job at?
Um, I mean, I think a lot about land use and transportation, and so I look at those policies often from a racial equity lens,
Hmm.
and I think about, we're considering building. I think as USA Today said that we have the best bike path in the country, and it's a 5.5 mile trail that goes along a sunken abandoned rail corridor. It's
Hmm.
called the Midtown Greenway, and we're thinking about building another one similar in North Minneapolis, which is where it's the predominantly black neighborhood of town,
Hmm.
and it would be a linear park. It wouldn't be a sunken rail corridor, but it would be a linear park that's dedicated to non-motorized transportation. And a lot of the response has been overwhelmingly from the minority white homeowners in the neighborhood, and they're worried about parking near their places.
Uh-huh.
And I just think that when we're thinking about these big decisions and investing money and how we're building our city, it just really makes me sad when I hear people be like, well, am I going to have to ask my friends to park a block away, when they come over once a month? Like that seems to be a lower order of a concern than how are we, helping everybody achieve the same, levels of health in the city.
Yeah, yeah. The obsession with parking, in I think in the city I live in, or I live outside of Rochester, New York, is maybe emblematic of some places. I think it may be a little bit worse here, but it really is crazy how anytime there's something like there's a proposal like build something, people are like, oh, there'll be nowhere to park, or it almost is almost like a Yogi Berraism. It's like, oh, there's too much traffic there. No one will go there. There's too much traffic. It's like, this is like a logical impossibility that no one goes there. There's too much traffic. Um,
It is.
and
Yeah, that's
and I
really
mean,
missed.
yeah, I mean, so there's like a weather aspect to this too, because it's very cold here, and it's even colder in the Twin Cities, for a large part of the year. And so, if you have to park somewhere far away and walk in the cold, that's not a lot of fun. But yeah, there really is this kind of more like suburban kind of vision of like you'll be in your car, and then the park spot will be like right there, and you'll walk out and right into wherever you want to go.
Hmm. Yeah, it's a lot of work, but I think it's worth it to sort of get excited about having cool stuff in your town and not just worry about is there going to be enough parking for everything, every single day of the year.
Yeah, yeah, it is.
And congested streets are it's an indicator of a healthy city, I think.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. It is kind of a weird, a weird, a weird thing. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about this thing you sent me about this kind of like rebranding campaign of, so where, like, what part of the country is Minneapolis in? So, I think like Upper Midwest is what I would have said before I read any of this stuff. But there's this campaign to rebrand the region north. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, yeah. Upper. So I have some friends who came to grad school from California, and yeah, he said that everybody gave him like the craziest look when he said he was moving to Minneapolis, and then he got here and he found out that we had great Ethiopian food and Vietnamese food, and that all the cool bands came through town, and just is really loving it here, and so he took a look at some of the just at our retention rates, and he said that Minneapolis has a branding problem, and if Midwest is just a vague label, I don't really know where it is.
Mm-hmm.
It's just flyover country, right? It's and
yeah, there was a quiz online. Did you see this a couple of years ago that was like asking you to draw the borders of the Midwest, and then you would compare yours to like what other people have done? Did you see that?
Yeah, I did, and I saw that a lot of people from eastern states like included Montana and just maybe Idaho in the Midwest.
Uh-huh.
And so, yeah, so I do like I would have called Minneapolis or Minnesota in the upper Midwest as well, because I guess like maybe Missouri and Kansas are Midwest kind of.
Yeah. I mean, they're kind of southern Midwest. If that makes any sense.
That sounds even worse.
Uh-huh.
But so yeah, the North, maybe we're borrowing a little cachet from Canada, being sort of liberal and friendly. But I also like it because it's embracing winter. When you think of the North, you think of winter, and that's something that I think we need to do more of. I ride my bike year round. I think it's pretty fun. I grew up sledding and ice skating and going on ski trips when we could, and so I see winter sports as sort of a luxury, and so I really enjoy riding my bike, and the way that I can interact with the city like that. If I see a cool, I don't know, I can stop and take a picture, or stop and grab a bite to eat, or stop and say hi to a friend if I'm riding through the city, and all these sorts of things that I can't do if I'm in a car.
Okay, so where would the geographical boundaries of this north region of the United States? Where do you think they would lie?
Yeah, it's kind of hard to draw the boundaries because I guess it's human nature to try to put yourself in the middle of any category that you're coming up with, and so so it's just natural to say, well, it's Minnesota and then all of the surrounding states, so North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, and Wisconsin. I think those are, well, less so Wisconsin with Scott Walker, but just I don't know. It's so yeah, I'd say those five states.
And would you say that like there is like a different culture in this area that we would call North than in the rest of the Midwest, or the non-North Midwest?
I think so, and I think it's sort of like it's a relation between like urban and rural populations. I think in some parts of the country there's an antipathy between city slickers and country people, but I grew up in a small town in southern Minnesota, and I've wanted to live in Minneapolis since I was like 12, and me and my parents would come up for to see theater, or to come up for a Twins game, and I think you really you sort of have respect for the major like universities that are in the cities and everything. And I have a friend who came over here from Louisville, and he said like in Louisville you can wear a shirt that says "I hate Kentucky," and that makes sense in the city. Like you're siding yourself with the city against the greater state. And in
Right.
Minneapolis, that would not make any sense. In Minneapolis and St. Paul, if you had a shirt that said, "I hate Minnesota," people would say, well, so what? Then leave.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting. I mean, so I also wanted to ask you about the Twin Cities aspect of it. I mean, so this is kind of like a unique arrangement in the country, I think. Maybe there's some other ones that I mean, usually when there's kind of a big city and then a smaller city, it's like the smaller city is like much more poorly governed and much poorer than the big city. So I mean, the
Hmm.
classic one, and often they're in different states. So like Gary, Indiana with Chicago, or Camden, New Jersey with Philadelphia.
Hmm.
I mean, how do you see first of all, like why are these two different cities? Why is it not just one city? And how do they interact with each other?
Um, why are there two different cities? I I wish I could answer that, but I just know that there were just some like early settlements in like the 1850s, I think, and
Hmm.
Downtown Minneapolis and downtown St. Paul are about like 10 or 15 miles apart, and
Hmm.
so when they were settled, that was a significant distance, and they're both located on like at bends in the Mississippi River, and so I
Hmm.
think there's some strategic advantage to that, if you're trying to build a settlement and I don't know, defend against Indian tribes or something, or
Hmm.
construct mills that and catch stuff off of boats. So I think that's the sort of like hydrological, geographic
Hmm.
reason for the two downtowns. But yeah, I mean, there's a distinct character between St. Paul and Minneapolis. St. Paul has it's more of a college town mixed with a capital. If you go downtown, it feels much, I don't know, it feels older than downtown Minneapolis. It
Hmm.
feels a little bit more like downtown Chicago. I mean, a lot smaller, but it was
Hmm.
like a little more European than Minneapolis, that has some taller buildings.
Hmm.
And yeah, I guess the thing about this might be too nerdy, but Minneapolis's streets were oriented north-south. The longer blocks go north-south, and
Hmm.
in St. Paul, it's all organized east-west, which is, I guess, an older way of planning out your city. And so,
Hmm.
yeah, there's a lot you can learn from the sort of block layout and block size, and you can tell, when that part of the city was developed.
Hmm. And are there like cultural differences between, or like people in Minneapolis saying like, "Oh, that's such a St. Paul thing to do," or something like that?
just just closing up shop early. St. Paul's a sleepier town.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I mean, that's where Garrison Keillor does Prairie Home Companion at the Fitzgerald Theater in uh,
Hmm.
downtown St. Paul. It's 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 coming back though. I think like there's an area of downtown St. Paul that's right next to a farmer's market, that there's a building boom over there. I think the mayor of St. Paul called it the biggest hipster area code in America, 55401. No, 55101, sorry.
Uh-huh.
And so yeah, it's more, there are more colleges over there. It's a lot. Yeah, it's very proud of its sort of Victorian housing stock.
Hmm.
Yeah, and Minneapolis is, I don't know, they're more art punks over here, and not just that, but they're a lot with Target headquarters downtown. I think there are a lot more sort of squares in Minneapolis too.
Uh-huh. And
Yeah.
Minneapolis is much bigger, or at least significantly bigger than St. Paul, right?
Yep, it's about well, St. Paul is about 300,000 people, and Minneapolis is about 400,000 people, and so
Hmm.
yeah,
Okay, so not that much
it's
bigger
not
in
like
that
Dallas
case.
Fort Worth or anything.
Right.
They're pretty similarly sized.
Right. Oh, so I had one other kind of Minnesota Minneapolis question, which is the Mall of America is outside
Hmm.
Minneapolis, and that's kind of like first of all, like why do you think that is? Like why do you think the thing that was called Mall of America happens to be located outside Minneapolis? And like is it weird that like a city that is getting a lot of praise for like doing city things right, like is near this place that's kind of the symbol of like the ultimate like suburbanization of the country, a mall.
Yeah, what can I say about the Mall of America? The last time I was there, I was part of a Black Lives Matter demonstration.
Hmm.
And I don't know if you saw any of the pictures from that. I saw like
No, so you protested inside the mall?
yeah, well, I actually didn't get. I got into a Sears, and they'd already closed the mall, closed all like the gates from the anchor stores into the mall, and weren't
Huh.
allowing anyone in. I think there were
Oh wow.
several thousand people there,
Hmm.
and they were the city of Bloomington, which is where the Mall of America actually is. They had already brought in their police force in riot gear, and had sort of there was no violence
So
at all, but like
cops and riot gear were actually inside the mall.
yes, yes.
Wow. So I mean, that's kind of a bizarre image. I mean, the thing about, I mean, I'm sure you know a lot more about malls than I do, but like, it used to be that like the town square
Hmm.
was, the central
Yeah, it's a
place
third
for
place.
commerce, politics to happen, and then anyone can march through the town square.
Hmm.
Like if you have a permit or even without a permit, you
Hmm.
can go there and spout off whatever whatever stuff you want. But like the mall has a private owner, and you can't. They can kick you out if you are marching
Hmm.
through it in the way that they can't kick you out if you're marching across the town
Hmm.
square. So I mean, this is
Yeah,
like the suburban vision of politics and culture.
yeah, yeah. I
Um,
think someone called it a simulacrum of public space, and
uh-huh.
that's a big problem in Minnesota actually, because we like to brag that Southdale, which is in Edina, Minnesota, it was the first enclosed indoor shopping mall in the United States, built
Hmm.
in the 50s or 60s. And that sort of space where it feels public, you don't need to pay a ticket, you don't need to buy a ticket to get in.
Hmm.
And, everyone's sort of, it seems like they're welcome. Uh, but as soon as anyone starts, dissenting or trying to you know, convince people of things or engage in political activity, then the
They'll
police
kick you
come in.
out.
Yeah,
Right.
and there was the Mall of America wasn't the only time that happened. I think it might have been a year ago. So we have a skyway system, which is like an elevated system of halls that connects a bunch of different buildings in our downtowns.
Hmm.
And there was a guy who was sitting in a skyway in St. Paul and waiting for his kids to get out of daycare. And
Right. This story went national. I
yeah, yeah,
remember reading
and
about
a
this.
police officer like arrested him, and I think did they tase him or spray mace on
And
him? But
yeah, I think they tased him, but this guy was African American.
yeah, yeah, and so that's another way in which we've been building a lot of this semi or pseudo public space, and the way that we regulate it is pretty racist, and so
Hmm.
that's a big problem in having this sort of Mall of America and our skyway system and not true public space.
Hmm. Yeah. So I mean, skyways make me think of one other giant Minnesota thing, which we mentioned already, which is the weather.
Hmm.
And you said you want to kind of promote winter sports and say and you ride your bike all year round, but I think you are kind of probably an outlier.
Hmm.
And I live in a place that's very cold, not as cold as Minneapolis, but actually after visiting Minneapolis a year and a half ago and liking it a lot, I was looking into kind of the weather stuff, and we actually get a lot more snow than you guys
Mm.
do here in Western New York. So I mean, like, you know, can we convince people to move somewhere that's cold? Will like the slow grinding of global warming make places that are cold and snowy, more like during parts of the year nicer to live in? I mean, what do you think about that?
Well, I mean, unless you're like talking about, the like nice coastal sliver of California, you're gonna have a place, you're gonna live in a place where it's not fun to be outside like, year round in America. And
Right.
I've two brothers. They both live in Houston, Texas, and they're really big into running and outdoor sports. But there are times when they can't, train for a marathon outside because it's 95 degrees and it's humid, and it's
Hmm.
just it's unhealthy to be outside in that temperature. And so
Hmm.
I think you need to take a look at what chunk of the year is it nice to be outside? And I think we have a pretty sizable chunk from May to October where it's at least 50 degrees outside.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, between that and, you know, I do like skiing and ice skating a lot. So I do, you know, I just, if you just have a nice coat, you know, like what's more expensive? Like, you know, like paying for rent in, you know, in an apartment in a palm tree lined street in you know, Santa Barbara, California, or buying a nice winter coat and like, you know, saving a whole bunch of money on housing in Minnesota.
Right, right. So layers, that's what would be your
Yeah.
recommendation. Why don't we talk about just the housing bit for a little bit? I mean, a big part of this article that Derek Thompson wrote was housing affordability, which is, you know, a huge thing. I've discussed it on a couple previous episodes of Blogging Heads. So, I mean, it seems like the cost of living and especially the cost of housing in the Twin Cities is pretty good compared to other, you know, metro areas that have strong economies.
Yeah, I took down a couple numbers. It's housing is 15% less than it is in Chicago. It's 28% less than it is in Portland. It's 30% less than it is in Seattle, and it's 34% less than it is in Boston. And that's just housing. It's not the whole cost of living, you know, with goods wrapped into it too, or transportation, I guess. Which might work one way or another depending on the city.
And is that just because of the geography and there's lots of places to expand, or why is housing fairly affordable there?
I mean, geography does play a big part of it. You know, with Chicago, like you can't develop very far east before you start getting wet. But in Minnesota, you know, in Minneapolis, you can just keep going basically out. And people do. Like I used to have a coworker who would commute 90 miles in from, you know, a small town in the middle of Minnesota, just one way, and you know, that doesn't sound like the life that, you know, I would enjoy, but she's taking up one less spot in Minneapolis, and so that's, you know, decreasing the rents in the central city.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. But I was talking to a friend from Chicago, and he's a planning student at the University of Chicago, and he was talking about how some of the apartment buildings that we're building just in the middle of the city, not you know, outside the central business district, but still within the city limits, like 4 or 5 story apartment buildings. They're illegal in about like 95% of Chicago, and so the ability to build up and to allow you know, developers to put more housing units on a parcel of land, you know, increases the supply, which will help keep prices down.
Right. So they're illegal because of height limitations or like parking requirements or what?
Zoning, yeah. So it's just it's called the floor area ratio, which is the, you know, total amount of floor area you can have per unit of, you know, per ground area. And so if it's a floor area ratio of 1 or of 1, you can build a 1-story building that covers the entire lot, or a 2-story building that covers half the lot. If that makes sense.
Yeah. So that leads to, you know, shorter buildings.
Yeah.
If you have a lower floor area ratio.
Yeah, shorter buildings and higher rents, I would argue.
Right. So I also, I mean, I've let you plug, you know, Minnesota a lot. I like I said, I've just visited once and liked it a lot, and I was really surprised by, you know, the diversity there. I guess, you know, I had the image of, you know, just a Midwestern, upper Midwest white city, but, you know, there's a number of different immigrant communities there, and you know, lots of different you know, ethnic restaurants, and, you know, it's a, you know, a national city for sure. It's not like a second or third tier city. Since this is a culture show, I want to talk briefly about, you know, Minnesota culture and how it's affected American culture. I mean, you listed some prominent filmmakers, writers, artists, radio people from Minnesota. I mean, what do you think are kind of what's like the epitome of Minnesota in terms of the arts?
You know, I would say you always have Prince.
Right.
Yeah, the Coen brothers, between you know, Fargo, which most most of Fargo doesn't take place in Fargo. It takes place in the Twin Cities. There's a Serious Man by Fargo too, takes place in St. Louis Park, I think, which is a of suburb of Minneapolis.
Yeah, that's a great movie. I think it's a really, really funny movie.
Yeah. Let's see now what else. Oh yeah, Garrison Keillor. I mean, Jonathan Franzen's Freedom took place here, and then I don't know. I want to lay claim to lumbersexuality as you know, a distinctly like Minnesotan thing.
Right,
I'm,
right.
I'm,
So
I'm wearing, I'm wearing a pair of.
I first heard that term recently. Could you describe what it is?
Yeah, I mean it's a new like grooming and fashion trend where men grow beards and wear boots and wear sort of working clothes, expensive working clothes, that are maybe reproduced or put together by Red Wing or like Levi's Made in America, and just kind of look like lumberjacks, but spend a
Right.
good deal of money doing it.
Right. So how would you? So I mean, I grew a beard recently, and you have a beard as well. How would you differentiate lumbersexuality from just the hipster, the bearded hipster? Do you think there's a difference there?
I think there's an irony in hipsterdom. He might see a funky mustache, that he knows looks stupid, or I don't know, a tattoo of something silly. But I think lumbersexuality is trying to get at something earnest and sincere, and I think that it's reaching back to sort of the fashion of our grandfathers, some of us, and and saying, just trying to grab onto something real that lasts. I mean, at least that's how I feel like in Minnesota, knowing that I grew up, knowing someone who works at Red Wing Boots, and I don't know, knowing that my grandpa always wore, like flannel shirts until he died, and so just hoping that you can just tap into something that's kind of timeless, and so
Well, that's interesting. So I think, yeah. So I mean, some of the hipster stuff is like you do things ironically, and just because you wear like old man glasses just to be ironic. But other parts of it are kind of like doing things that like listening to vinyl records or riding a fixie bike. So I mean that seems more like you're trying to recapture some kind of authenticity from generations past. So you think the lumbersexuality is a lot more about sincerity than irony?
yeah, I do. I think you can find some overlap, like I don't know, like a pipe or something. Pipe smoking is probably like that happens in both camps. But yeah, I guess it is kind of hard for me to distinguish them and keep them separate, which is kind of what I like about Minneapolis. There's a lot of it's a pretty diverse place, like you said.
Right, and we alluded to it before. The Fitzgerald Theater, I assume, is named after F. Scott Fitzgerald. And The Great Gatsby is a contender for the Great American Novel, and that's about someone who left the Midwest, came east, and was disillusioned. And I think at the end of the book, he returns to the Midwest, and that's where Nick is narrating it from. So that's certainly a great contribution to American culture from Minneapolis. Okay, I think we're about at the end of our time. Anything else you want to say about Minnesota, Minneapolis, St. Paul, lumbersexuality?
Come check us out. We have James Beard Award winning restaurants. We have architecturally awarded art museums. We have I don't know, great.
Right, there's a Gary designed art museum attached to the university, right?
Yep. That's what is it? Oh, I don't know. The Wiseman Art Museum. Yeah. So yeah, it's a great place to come visit and come live too.
Yeah, I did not eat a bad meal in the 4 or so days that I was in the greater Minneapolis region. So I enjoyed it a lot, and hopefully I will be able to come visit it again.
Yeah.
So Scott, thank you so much for coming on Culture Determined, and thanks to our viewers, and we'll see you again next time.
Thanks. Take care.